Okay, let's go ahead and get started, guys. Hope you all had a good spring break. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. So we were running through our web design principles slide. So we talked about similarity. We talked about rhythm in our websites. We talked about using direction to kind of guide the user to consume our website and the order that we want and how it makes sense. We talked about dominance, so using things like contrast and white space and size and position to indicate what's most important on our page, to kind of give the user a sense of information hierarchy on our page, what's most important, what's second important, so on and so forth. So we're going to continue. We've got one more principle to talk about, and then we'll jump over and talk a little bit about color theory and how to choose good colors for our website. And so we'll get into that in a minute. So the next principle to talk about is contrast. So contrast causes certain parts of our site to stand out because of differences between other elements on the page. So, we talked about similarity, which is where we want things to kind of look similar. We want to style certain things the same. We want to create some sense of repeating elements on our page by making them look similar. Contrast is the opposite of that, right? So we use contrast to make things stand out against one another, to provide just visual interest, honestly. Some of these, I kind of take a very usability bent, or a very, how we make our site more usable, but at the same time, these are principles that just make good-looking websites and good-looking design in general. Using contrast makes it more visually interesting, makes it more appealing. So we can create contrast in all kinds of ways. We can create contrast with size, some big elements, some small elements. We can use color. Lightness and darkness, texture, shapes, line quality, dotted versus dashed, so on and so forth. All kinds of properties can be used to create contrast. There's no, it's not limited to certain properties, just ways that we make things look different. Contrast allows the user's attention, again, to be drawn to important elements on a page. So contrast is kind of a tool we can use to create dominance. And it can also be used to distinguish between similar but different elements. So, say you have like a Learn More button and a Sign Up button. Those two buttons kind of have different audiences, right? Learn More is more for people who are maybe first-time visitors to your website. They aren't very familiar with your product. They want to kind of learn more. Sign Up is something that's a recurring user. That's someone who already knows your product. They already have an account. Or log in maybe would be that case. Sign Up is someone who is ready to go. So you want to use some contrast to distinguish between those elements. Like, they're different actions and you want them to be easy to find. You want users to see them easily, so you can use contrast to distinguish between those. Even though they're similar, they're buttons, they're links. In some ways you want to use similarity. You want them to be the same shape, the same size, but you might use color to create some contrast between those different actions. Another easy example is like, edit versus delete. Those are, similar things. They're going to be buttons. You want them to look similar, but they're also very different, and you want delete to be red, while edit may be less, contrasted with that, so that it's clear that one is more destructive than the other. It's cut off the rest of this, but let me see if I can fix that actually. So again, contrast is also important for ensuring that a website is legible. We've talked about this several times already. I'm harping on it because it's really important that you have a good contrast ratio between your foreground and your background, making sure that your website is easy to read and also not too harsh on the eyes. So again, kind of going back to this painting that we've been using to illustrate some of these design principles, there's a lot of contrast in here. There's kind of this dark area here and a really strong contrast with this lighter area here. You know, even the people have kind of a stark contrast versus their background. The shadows kind of stand out using contrast. You know, if those shadows weren't quite so stark, you may not notice them, and that's an interesting part of the painting. There's lots of contrast, even this, you know, the reds here and the blues here. There's lots of contrast, and it's part of what makes the piece interesting and beautiful, is that there's contrast. It makes it interesting to look at and to think about. So on a website, this is kind of an example of what not to do. This is a relatively low contrast website. You look at it, there's a lot of similarity here, especially just in like the sizes of things. Like, you know, this heading here is really the same size text as this heading, which is the same size text as this main text. Everything's the same size, everything's kind of the same shade. You know, this gray color is the same as this gray color, is the same as this gray color. You know, there's a little bit of contrast here in this date, at least it stands out a bit. You know, this sidebar here, the links have a little bit too low contrast. They don't really stand out against their background very well. I mean, this text is okay, you know, the contrast with the background here, but it's just kind of boring looking, right? It just looks very plain, very boring. It's not very interesting. So if we were to improve it, we can do some really subtle, simple things to make it better and make it more interesting. So for one, we've taken the title and made it bigger. We've had it taken up more space. That contrasts it between these other headings and these other text elements. It's bigger, so it stands out a little bit more. We've also increased the contrast between the foreground and the background here. So it's a little bit darker text and a little bit lighter background. You'll also notice even just the colors, like, you know, the difference between this background color and this background color. Here, it just sort of washes out. It's just a bland, it kind of all looks like the same, you know, color. It just looks old. But here, at least, with having more contrast between these two background colors and this kind of background image over here, it makes it more interesting. It somehow just kind of comes alive a little bit more because there's more contrast used. There's better contrast here between the foreground and the background with these links. So again, really, really small changes. Really, all we did is change the background color, increase the size, and it improved the site quite a bit. Even these headings, even though, you know, the size is still the same, but this background color contrasts more with the background color here now, so it stands out more. Like, this is a little bit more prominent as a heading, so it improves its function as a heading just because it's more prominent. This is a really good use of contrast. So this is Stripe, which is a payment processor. So they do a really great job. They use, you know, these bold colors. They use contrast to kind of make things stand out. You know, they've got their heading here, which is, honestly, is kind of competing with other elements, but at least by its positioning and its size, it kind of stands out as the most dominant thing. They use, you know, contrast here to distinguish between these two actions they want you to take, create an account versus contact sales. You know, so you quickly see that, you see the difference. It kind of gets you thinking, okay, what should I do there? They also use, have this little new tag to kind of help this stand out. So if you're a recurring, you know, someone who's familiar with their product and you've come back to their site for some reason, it'll stand out there. Oh, there's a new feature. That's nice. They have checkout flows. So they're kind of drawing your attention there if you're, you know, someone who is a recurring user. Even just visually, you know, they've got this dark background with the light foreground here, and then they create a strong contrast with this element here and kind of, I don't even actually know what this is supposed to be illustrating. Salesforce, it's not even really relevant. I would prefer for this to be, you know, some sort of a screenshot of their product or what they actually do. Instead, they just have this tablet with an interface on it. But it looks nice. Like, just, from afar, like, you go to this page, like, okay, they've got some information that's easy to read, and they've got a lot of contrast that makes the site look interesting. I think that's the only example of contrast that I have. So kind of bringing it all together. So we've talked about dominance, so creating visual hierarchy using size, position, color to, and honestly contrast is a tool that we use to create dominance. To make the important things stand out on our page, make the less important things less important. We've talked about using similarity primarily for just creating a polished professional look. If we have elements that are styled similarly, they don't have to be exactly the same, but if we have certain patterns of design that are repeated throughout the site. And same goes for rhythm. Rhythm is about having elements that are repeated in predictable ways, and it creates some sense of familiarity because you see the same types of patterns throughout. Direction to kind of guide the user's eye, help the user engage with your content, and then contrast to make things stand out against each other. All of these things combined, these are all tools that we can use to create a nice website that's aesthetically pleasing and also accomplishes your goals for the user. So again, you can accomplish a strong design without a ton of decoration. So we don't necessarily need to tons of fancy images and fancy header images and lots of design elements to make a nice page. We can have a really simple web page and just use these tools well to take our content and structure it in a nice way and style it in a nice way. It's kind of coming back in the 90s, early 2000s. The trend was to kind of just throw as much on your website as you could. Like, you wanted a website with lots of images and animated things and, buttons that moved around. I don't know. It was kind of this design trend of more is better, more is better. But now it's kind of gone the opposite way. We rejected that, and it's a lot more simple designs, keep things minimalist, and use these tools to make your design look good and make it usable. I can't hit enough, too, how important it is that we combine those two things of having an aesthetically pleasing design that looks good, that looks polished, that looks professional, because that inspires trust in your customers. It inspires interest in your product. It's so important to have a website that looks good. If you have a website that doesn't look good or looks unprofessional, people won't trust you. People might not be interested in what you're selling. It's just not good. At the same time, you need a website that's usable, that's easy to navigate, that's easy to find what's important. I can't tell you how many times I've seen a website that looks great. It's obviously been very well styled, or at least put a lot of thought into it. But it's not usable. It's not easy to find what you're looking for. They don't have content structured well. Sometimes the main page of some company's website may look great, but it doesn't tell you any information about the company, and you have to hunt to find what you're looking for. You guys have all gone through this, I'm sure. So really important that we take our aesthetics of our design, that's hugely important, and we take the usability of our design. And we can use these tools to create both, to kind of join those two things together and use both of them to make a good website. Okay, here's an example. Yeah, so this was just an example of, I created a city guide assignment that you guys did. So this is just kind of the pure HTML, right? So, the heading and we've got some text and a link. I've got a 3-column layout. If you think about the dominance on this page, the images stand out as the most dominant, simply because they're the largest. There's a lot of contrast because these are really colorful and bold, and the rest of the page is kind of boring. There's not really much similarity. There is in that these things are styled the same. All my headings are styled the same, but they're not really styled interestingly at all. So it's just kind of boring. There's some repetition or rhythm in that, you know, we have this 3-column layout. We know that there's a heading followed by a brief explanation, followed by a photo, followed by a description. That's nice, but it's pretty boring. It definitely doesn't look professional. I wouldn't trust this person if I was, you know, reading his guide. I'd be like, wow, this guy seems weird. I don't know that I believe what he says. But here's how we could improve. This is kind of going along with the design trend that we've seen a lot in a lot of the examples that I've shown, which is kind of what startups are kind of going for. So we've created a ton of white space around our heading and around some of our, you know, main content, right? So we've used our white space to make our heading stand out. It's very clear what this website is doing. You know, this website, what is it? I mean, I guess, you know, again, your eyes first drawn to the picture, so you might miss, you know, what else is going on. Why are these pictures here? I don't know. Here it's very clear what the opinion of the author is, right? Like, it's very clear what this website is here for. Really easy to find kind of a further explanation of what the site's about. Also, this call to action is a lot more, it's not the most dominant thing on the page, but it's, you know, secondary. So it's really easy to see what the call to action is. So, okay, yeah, you've hooked me. I agree. What do I do? Okay, sign up for the newsletter. And ultimately, you know, if this was a business or a blog or something, I was trying to get, you know, readers that I could engage with regularly, signing up for the newsletter is huge. You know, so I did the same thing that Airbnb did here. So I moved, you know, the bulk of my content doesn't have to be right at the top of your page. I've kind of moved it down. I've given you a little bit of a glimpse. I've kind of given you some idea of what to expect on my page. I say restaurants, you know, and kind of show you a hint of the picture, show you the titles. You can kind of see what's there. But one, it's removed the dominance of the photos, so these photos don't stand out as the most important thing on the page anymore. But it does create some direction saying, hey, you can scroll down to learn more. If you want to see some pictures of food, scroll down. Because at this point, if someone's hooked, they're going to keep exploring your website. But we've hooked them rather than, you know, if you pull up this page, you're like, okay, well, that looks nice. But you're not hooking them as effectively. You're just kind of, you know, throwing all your content on one page and sort of trusting the user to sort it out. Also, this page with just a little bit of style. There's no decoration here, right? There's no added, you know, images or any fancy decoration. It's still just a white background with, you know, dark text. But it seems a lot more professional. You're a lot more likely to trust this person. It's a lot more effective and engaging with just a really simple design. It's nothing too fancy, but it seems a lot better. So again, you don't have to adorn your websites with crazy, you know, design elements. You can be really minimalist and still have an effective design. And then, yeah, so this is, you know, if you were to go ahead and scroll down, I've created a little bit more similarity. You know, I've created a little more information hierarchy in our heading and our subheading. I've, you know, created some similarity and some rhythm here by, you know, using color effectively just to kind of color the heading of those descriptions. We know what to expect because of rhythm. Each, you know, item here has a location, a website, and a menu. We know that that's there, and it looks good. It creates a kind of unified. We've got an image, a paragraph, and then 3 buttons, and you can kind of expect that to be true. And we've done the same. So, you know, now you've seen one section, you see entertainment section here, you kind of know what's going to follow, right? And you even know that under entertainment is probably some other section. So if you're, you know, you've seen some of the content, but you kind of know what else to expect on the page. So if you're interested in what else is there, you're going to keep scrolling. Okay, any questions on design? These design principles that we've talked about. You know, the struggle with, you know, this kind of thing is I try to show a lot of examples and kind of, you know, we're kind of explaining high-level things that you sort of have to learn as you go. It's hard to say, do this exactly, do this exactly, do this exactly, because it just depends on what your website is. It depends on, you know, what your goals are. So hopefully I've given you a good idea of some of the tools you can use to create an effective website. The next assignment, which I haven't posted on Blackboard yet. What am I waiting on? There we go. So the next assignment will be based on that lecture. Simply just pick a couple of websites that maybe are your favorite websites or just websites you're familiar with that you feel have good designs. And I'm just going to have you write up a couple sentences on each of those design principles that we've talked about, kind of explaining how that website uses that design principle effectively. So, so be thinking about, you know, websites that you've seen that you've liked, or do some Googling or whatever. Again, I'll post it on Blackboard later today. It'll be due just, we'll have it be due Friday at the end of the day, so you'll have the rest of the week to work on it. But I'll have you do probably 2 websites. So find 2 websites, and it'll be a couple of sentences on each of those design principles, just to kind of explore how they're used, just to kind of start to get you to think critically about the designs of other websites. And they can be negative examples too, or negative uses. You know, I say, hey, the contrast is poor here, they didn't do a good job of that. That's okay as well. But just think about how those design principles come into play for those websites. Okay, let's talk about color. So obviously the use of color in web design is very subjective, as is color in most things. People like different colors, don't like different colors. But there are some principles and best practices we can follow. Color choices absolutely can make or break a web design. So if you choose poor colors, you can take a great layout and make it ugly, especially if you have colors that clash. You know, if you choose one color, you're probably going to be safe as long as it's an okay color. But once you start bringing in 2 colors or 3 colors, it can start to look bad really quick. I've had websites that I've really struggled with choosing colors. Like, I'll kind of know roughly, okay, I'm going to use blue and green for this website, but nailing down the exact shades to use can be really tricky, and it's almost just magic. Like, once you figure it out, once you get a good color combination, it kind of changes the site and makes it look way better. Whereas if they're just slightly off, it's just like, it doesn't feel right. So again, it's very subjective, but we've got some principles that we can follow. One important thing to point out with color is it can be used to direct user action or convey meaning of content. So, you know, we use red for errors, green for success, or blue for information. That's an important thing to keep in mind with your website, is how to kind of use colors to convey some meaning of your content. So first, background color. So choosing background color is really important. It kind of sets the tone of your website. It gives you kind of your base color to build off of or to contrast with. You can change background color on some elements to kind of help them stand out. So buttons, we do this, right? Really, buttons are just links with a little bit of extra padding and a different background color to kind of make them stand out. Again, white backgrounds are the most common. They provide the most contrast when you've got dark foreground elements. One thing that I've noticed, and it's important to keep in mind, sites with really widespread audiences are most likely to use a white background. So you think of like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, any website that's like a huge website, they all have white background colors. It's just it's the most professional seeming. It's the least obtrusive. So if you really want to focus on your content and on your UI and the things on your website, having the white background color kind of disappears. It can seem a little stark. It can be a little utilitarian. So again, for a website like Google, they want their entire website is very utilitarian, so they don't need to soften it with a different background color. But if you're, building a website for your personal, babysitting business or something, you might not want it to appear stark or utilitarian. You want it to feel warmer, so we might not use white as the background color. Off-white is a really good option for more design sites. So again, sites that are a little bit more focused on style, less utilitarian, a little bit more stylish. Off-white is a really good choice. It's a little easier on the eyes. For example, the background of the slideshow is off-white. If you're staring at your screen, it's not as harsh, it's not as bright. I like to use FA, which is the background color of the slideshow. It's kind of just a slight off-white. It's a nice warm background color that looks pretty good. So again, that's a really good choice if you want to have a dark foreground. You want to just kind of soften up your site and help make it feel a little bit more designed. So here's an example with Slack. They have a light background. I don't think that's pure white, but it's pretty close. It gives them a good, they use, color very effectively. They've chosen kind of their main, style color. They even pull it in with their, image here. So it kind of gives it a cohesive feel color-wise, just by little tiny splashes of color. It makes a big difference. So, good example. This is the website I work on. We've got a white background because, again, it's pretty utilitarian. We're trying to help people focus on our content, focus on what they can do on our site. So we kind of want the background to fade away, and to not take away from the content. We want to just focus on what they're doing. Dark backgrounds are rarer, but they can be used to portray a sense of exclusivity or sophistication. So if you think about it, there's really not a ton of websites that have dark backgrounds. But you will see it sometimes for like restaurants or nightclubs or fashion designers, things that are trying to appear exquisite or exclusive might use a dark background. It kind of creates this, an expensive sense to a website. You can also use a background image with a subtle design to kind of help add some style to a dark background. I think I was on a good example. Go. This website, I believe, uses a dark background. Yeah, so this is a company that makes like high-end headphones. So they have a very dark background. They they have some kind of splashes of color, but they've the dark background kind of gives their site a sense. They're trying to be fancy. They're trying to be like the stylish headphones, and so they really effectively use their design to feel that way. Even their this is a really great design example. Even their font choices are using this this serif font. It looks official. It looks exclusive. They've got this really stylized photo with really good use of lighting. Let's see what else. They use some. They'll let me scroll. I don't know if you can tell on the screen here because it's kind of washed out, but there's a faint texture to the background here. It kind of looks, I don't know, like marble or something. Like dark marble is kind of the look that they go for with the background. So again, really, really good use of design and a good example of where a dark background is effective. and kind of creating a vibe. Like, because when I was thinking about dark background websites, I immediately thought of their website because it's like this is a company that is, you know, trying to portray themselves as an exclusive brand, and I knew that they had a dark background. It stuck with me. So that can be very, very effective. Brightly colored backgrounds, on the other hand, should be used very, very, very sparingly. Only for maybe high-impact sites with really important content would a brightly background color be effective. Again, they should be really deliberately chosen and match the other design elements on the site. Text is often really difficult to read on bright backgrounds, so you don't want to use them when there's lots of text content. So if you have, you know, a site with lots of text, you really don't want to choose a bright background color, because if it's a bright color in the background, usually black or white doesn't work as a good. You usually have to choose a really specific contrasting color for your text. So again, bright background colors use very sparingly and use very carefully. And you'll notice they're rare on websites. Very, very few websites use really bright colored backgrounds. Some examples. This is a good example of, you know, poor use of a dark background. This is a bad site in general, but you know, with this black background, red and blue, neither of them really work as foreground colors, right? It doesn't really work. The text's not very readable. It doesn't look professional. It's not a good website. Whatever it is they're selling, I'm not interested, because their website is not very very effective. Even here, you know, and this is an important thing to think about too, your background color or background images, you have to be very, very careful about. That text is not readable at all. I have no idea what those things say over there because I can't read it on top of that, you know, background image. So important to think about our backgrounds. Here's an example that I think is not a super wise use of a bright background. They've used this bright orange. Their, you know, text here is not easy to read. It looks extra bad, you know, on a projector that's washed out. But even on your screen, it's really hard to read that text. They use it looks kind of slightly off-white, I guess, is the color that they use. But it's not great. One thing, too, you run into using a bright background is anything that uses anytime you have to change the background color. So like this section here, they've switched to a light background. It makes it stand out a lot more. Anything that doesn't use that bright color as a background immediately jumps off the page, which you can use well, or you can use poorly. It's just something you have to keep in mind. In this case, you know, this sort of stands out as, you know, an important part of their page. Even this, you know, home button here stands out, like those pop out as important parts, and I'm not sure they are the most important parts, right? Like, those aren't the most important things on the page, yet they kind of jump out because their background is different. So, again, bright colored backgrounds, used very, very carefully. Here's a great use of a bright colored background. So they, you know, they've got this bright colored background. They've chosen it really carefully. It's not too bright. It's slightly muted. You know, it's not. They've kind of reduced the like not the contrast, the saturation a little bit. If this was an HSLA color, the saturation is dialed down a little bit, so that when they use this white text, it stands out against it, but it's also readable against it. There's a good contrast ratio there. You know, this text is maybe a little bit difficult to read if I was going to critique anything, but it's not so bad. And they actually use this bright background to their advantage by showing off their UI and making it stand out a lot. Thanks. So, you know, because if this was a white background and then they were trying to show these white UI elements, they'd have to find some other way to make these stand out because they just wouldn't really stand out. But because they have that bright background, these, you know, screenshots of their app really stand out. So this is a great design to get you interested. I like that design a lot. Okay, so main foreground color. So talk about background color. What about the color of the text on your page? When choosing the color for your text on the page, your contrast ratio is the most important consideration. So poor contrast will make your site unreadable. That's what you don't want. You don't want your site to be difficult to read or hard to read. There's a website that I linked you here. I think I showed it to you earlier that lets you check your contrast ratio, so you can put in two colors and see what the actual contrast ratio is, and it will even tell you if it's good or bad. Like there's the ADA has different requirements for what the difference between your foreground and background should be, and they'll give you like a letter grade based on what your contrast ratio is. So important to do that. Black and white or light and dark is always a good choice. You can reduce the contrast slightly from pure black and pure white to make it less fatiguing on the eyes, especially when there's lots of text involved and the users are going to be reading a lot. So like this slideshow, for instance, it's slightly off-white for the background, and it's not pure black for the foreground either. It's a slightly, it's like a really dark gray. And in fact, I think this is 555 for the foreground color, and FA for the background color. So when you're going to be doing lots of reading, you don't want to tire your user's eyes. So kind of dialing back the contrast slightly will help a lot. If you're doing a colored background, you should choose a complementary color of some sort for the best contrast. So if you do have a brightly colored background, you should choose a complementary color that's going to have the most contrast to that background. Generally, using one color for all of your text will look the best. Sometimes maybe links or certain strong or emphasized text you may want to change the color of, but typically you don't want to like alternate color between paragraphs or have different text on different parts of your page be different colors. Generally, for a professional design, you want a consistent text color across your site. Again, you might use an alternative color for headings to help them stand out in some designs, but generally I recommend to keep all of your text the same color. So like I said, typically the fewer colors used in design, the better, but at least one featured color is usually necessary for your links and your buttons or other elements that you want to emphasize on the page. So as you may have noticed from a lot of our examples, there's usually, a standard background color, a standard foreground color, and then some sort of color that creates some contrast and kind of pops a little bit that you'll use for buttons, for calls to action, those kinds of things. So we'll talk about these a little more, but you would want to use complementary or split complementary or triad colors to really produce the best results when choosing those kind of alternative colors. Again, use those colors sparingly to kind of help the elements stand out. So, Bloomberg has a really good example use of color. So, they've got kind of their main color here that, kind of stands out. Then they kind of use, the red and the green here to kind of help you see how the stock market's doing. That's a really good design pattern. If it's all red up here, like if all of them are red, you're going to see that pretty quickly. You say, uh-oh, it's a bad day. If they're all green, you go, okay, it's a good day. They use that use of color really effectively. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say here on color. Another example. Facebook uses really consistent colors. So, they've got their Facebook blue for all links, so anything that is this color, this blue color is something you can click on. Again, they've got a good, again, just white as the background color. They've got the slightly gray to kind of create some contrast between the different sections. So that's good. They've used this green here as their, kind of splash of color, their alternative color, their feature color, to kind of draw your eye to certain things that they want you to do. To kind of really emphasize, if this was just a blue button, it wouldn't stand out as much. You might not think to do it. So it's a good use as well. Oh, and they also use red up here for their notifications. So to help you, draw your eye to something that they want to draw your attention to. In this case, they've got some stuff that they want you to look at. This site is a good use of color as well. So again, just a light background, a dark foreground. They use a different background color for their headings, which I think looks nice. That helps it stand out. It also, creates some similarity and some rhythm, by using the color in their image. They, use the color here, as well as a little bit of size. They've made their download button bigger than their demo button, and use color to make it stand out a little bit more. So again, it's really clear, there's a good sense of dominance that's created by, the color choice. It's a really good use of sparing color to the site feels a lot more designed. It feels interesting. It's a great use of color. Okay, so one thing to mention too is monocolor or monochrome color scheme. So we're going to start talking about different color schemes you can use. Kind of start talking about some color theory, how to choose colors that go well together. One option is just to choose one color. You would use it in combination with white and black, to create your design, or off-white and a little bit like a dark gray. But often a monochrome design is a really safe choice. It avoids the risk of overusing colors or having mismatched colors. It can be a little boring. It's, you just have one color. That can get a little bit boring, but it's a really safe choice. I would even argue that, going back to Facebook is a little bit of a monochrome design, just in that they use blue all the time. Really, the green here is the only thing that really stands out. But another example, this is a good example of monochrome design. So they've got, a light background, a dark foreground. They've got one color that they use. They don't have to worry about clashing colors because they just chose one color and used that color well. So their logo's got that color. They've got their, kind of logo here. They use it to kind of help make text stand out. So again, don't feel like you have to, get all fancy and choose multiple colors that go well together. Sometimes just choosing one color and using it effectively can be a really smart decision. That's usually where I start when I design a website. I will, choose a color that, if it's like, a color that the company's logo uses or, somehow is associated with the company, I'll choose that one color. I'll design the site. I'll use that color where necessary for buttons and links and what have you. And then afterwards, I'll kind of decide, okay, do I need to add a different color? Do I need to, do I need to change this up? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But starting with just one color is a really good way to get started, and sometimes is great. Sometimes is effective. Especially, they use this pattern background to make it a little bit more interesting. They've got this, zigzag header that makes it a little more interesting. They've got, an interesting, design here with this image that makes it more interesting. They use this kind of double border here with a dark line and a lighter line to make it interesting. So even though it's only one color, they've added more design elements to make it seem more cohesive and make it seem more designed. So overall, it's a great design, and they're not hindered by their use of one color. Okay. So complementary colors. Again, we're kind of getting into color theory. I'm not an expert on color theory. I'm trying to kind of give you just enough to understand how to use colors, how to choose colors a little more effectively. I'm sure there's a whole class in the art department on color theory if you're really interested in learning more. But complementary colors are really important to learn. They appear opposite each other on the color wheel, so they're sort of like opposite colors is a way you can think of it. They provide a high level of contrast, honestly the highest level of contrast you'll find between complementary colors, while still being aesthetically pleasing when used together. So example, so we've got our color wheel, so like yellow and violet are complementary colors, red and green, blue and orange. They're opposite each other on the color wheel. They have a lot of contrast. They're the most different of colors, but they still look really nice. And it kind of makes sense, if you think of like orange and red, there's not as much contrast, or orange and yellow, not as much contrast. But if you jump, perfectly across the color wheel, that's where the most contrast is, while still looking good. You see complementary colors all the time. When you're kind of familiar with what complementary colors are, you're almost like, you see them everywhere. All kinds of logos. Even just here, if you look at these color combinations, if you're familiar with sports, you start to think, sports, oh, this is the Minnesota Vikings, this is the Florida Gators. Like, you just sort of like start to, think of how those complementary colors are used in sports teams or logos or stuff like that. So, here's Florida. They use that green and orange complementary colors. They look good together. Or sorry, the blue and the orange are the complementary ones. It looks good. Again, lots of contrast. They still look good together. You can have the orange foreground color on the blue background color, and it looks okay. Sports teams especially can get away with this because they don't have to have a particularly elegant design. It can be bold and in your face. So it's a good example of where using those complementary colors for the foreground and background makes a lot of sense. And here they use it here with these headings. A good use of that complementary colors. Here's a good example too with the green and the red. So they've got this red here, and then they've got the green over here. It's a good use of color. They look nice together. They're not clashing, even though they're different colors. It's even they did a smart. Those are smart choices of colors because it goes along with the images of their food. So they've got the green and the red in their food image. So hey, we'll use those for our design colors. Really, really smart. And if they had chosen, like if this company had chosen, say like, orange and purple or something as their colors, say their web designer is like, okay, I'm going to design your site. Let's use, orange because it is my favorite or whatever, and purple. And then all of a sudden you throw this big image in the middle. It's going to start to look bad now, right? Because you've got this image with the greens and the reds and the blues, but then you've got orange and purple everywhere else. So again, when you're designing a site, you really have to think about what's your content, what colors make sense to go with that content, and they've chosen very wisely here. Analogous colors are next to each other on the color wheel. So they don't provide very much contrast. They're very similar, but they can be useful for different types of foreground elements. So sometimes you want things that aren't super highly contrasted, but to kind of have different elements in your foreground that go well together but are different colors. This is a really great color scheme to use. So again, like we've got yellow-green, yellow, and yellow-orange or whatever. We could do the same with red and orange and purple or violet, or kind of a red, violet, blue, and light blue, light green, and blue, things like that. So here's a good example of using that with they've got the red and the orange and the green. So again, they've chosen colors that go well together. There's some that, and these are just different foreground elements. There's not a ton of contrast between like the red and the orange. But overall, it creates a design that goes well together. It looks nice, even though it's got different colors. Split complementary is really useful. I use this a lot. So it's where you have, you take a complementary color and then you choose the colors next to it. So the benefit is you get two colors to work with that are sort of semi-complementary, along with kind of your main color. So you provide some contrast. It's not the most contrast, but there's still a good deal of contrast between, here the yellow and the red, purple, the name of that color is losing me, and the green in that color. There's still a good amount of contrast, but now you also have the green and the yellow to work with that are more similar, so you can kind of use those together. So really useful for creating kind of a three-color palette where two of them are somewhat similar. So you might use this for the background and these two colors for your foreground, something along those lines. So Zappos is a good example. So they've got the orange here, and then the blue and the green are the split complementary colors from the orange. So, and this is a more subtle use. There are more, bold uses of it that you can have. But the blue and the green here are mixed really well on the page, so they can kind of alternate between blue and green for different things. They've got their blue for their header here, and they've got green for these subheaders, blue for their text, they've got green on their image for a heading, green up here. The blue and the green are the analogous colors that go well together, they blend well together, and then they can use the orange for just a strong pop of color. They can even have, an orange background almost or something. They could use the orange a little bit more boldly if they wanted to create some more strong contrast. I think I've got some more examples, I think, at the end. Another good way to choose three colors is triad colors. So they're evenly spaced on the color wheel. So you take three colors that are all equidistant from each other. So when you use those together, you can kind of create a vibrant but still balanced color palette. So again, it's not the most contrast, but it gives you three colors that work well together. There's also other color schemes that are similar, so you could use four evenly spaced colors for what we call a square color scheme. So you'd have like, yellow and this light blue, and this red purple, and somewhere in this red orange. To have four what we would call a square color scheme. So again, good for creating a really vibrant page. So like, the Zappos isn't a super vibrantly colored page, right? Because they have these analogous colors here. It doesn't like stand out a ton, but it's well blended, but it's not super vibrant because there's not a ton of contrast here. But when you're using triad colors, it's going to be a lot more vibrant. So here's one example between this this pink and this blue up here and that orange, and they use the blue and the purple. Here they could probably use the orange a little bit more, but it's a little more vibrant color scheme, and those are three evenly spaced colors. A color wheel. I think that's the only example I have of that. So, those are a bunch of different color schemes, but okay, how do you actually, choose what to use? So typically you want to start with one meaningful color for your design. So for instance, if it's a city guide, maybe choose a color that's correlated to that city. If it's a restaurant, choose a color that matches the restaurant decor or their logo or even their food if they're going to have a lot of images. If there's no meaningful color, just choose a color that you think goes well with that brand. And then you choose where you want to use the color, right? So again, like I said, I usually design my site initially either using no color or just using one color, and just kind of get my content down, figure out what I want to be most dominant. I kind of start with just the content, and then say, okay, where does it make sense to add color here? And then you can start to determine how many colors you need. How many levels of heading do you have? Do you want to use a background color on your headings to increase their dominance? Those kinds of things. So start with no color or very little color and then say, okay, where do I need to use color? How many colors do I need? And then you can start to choose the color scheme that makes the most sense for you. Whether you want to use triad colors to create a really vibrant site, or if you want to use split complementary to have, two, colors to work with and contrasting with your third. Or if you want to use, just complementary colors to have a, vibrant foreground and background, something along those lines. So again, once you decide how you want to use color, where you need it, then you can go about deciding your color schemes. And then there's online tools that let you try out different color schemes to kind of decide what works best. So Adobe has a really good one here with their color wheel. And sometimes if you just Google, like color designer or color wheel, there's all kinds of tools out there that let you do this kind of thing. This Adobe tool is nice if it loads. So you can choose the color rule that you want to use. So you can use if you want to do, choose if you want to do complementary, or if you want to do triad or analogous, and then you can, kind of click and drag your colors here. Because there's obviously different, things you can do. Like you can, click these and drag them out and choose, colors that are not quite as close, but maybe, if you want a little more vibrant, a little bit more difference between those colors, you can, separate them out. So now down here it gives you the colors that you can work with. So you can just kind of play around with this, and again, like I said, I like to choose my main color. So if I knew, that my main color was red, I might pull this over here, to red. So I've got red as the main color. And then I can kind of see what the different colors are that I can use. So, say I don't know, let's say this is like a steak restaurant or something, and so I want to use red to kind of correlate with steak. So I choose analogous. Purple doesn't really work with the vibe I'm going for with my steak restaurant. Let's kind of play around with this some more. So maybe analogous isn't the best, color rule. So let's look at like triad colors and see what that looks like. Okay, so I've got red, yellow, and blue. That almost feels like a child's room or something. If you were designing like a hospital room for a pediatrician or something, like maybe that would make sense if you're creating like a children's toy. Okay. Yeah, let's not do that. So maybe complementary and see what that looks like. So you've got green. Maybe that's still not quite what you want. So honestly, I would probably go with just monochromatic with this, and maybe choose some different shades of red to use, or maybe take our triad, and there should be a way to break it out into 4. But anyway, you can start to play with it and figure out what works for you, figure out what you want to do. I don't really know what compound is. That's just a different, this looks a little better. Maybe we would use, these colors to create our steak restaurant. Anyway, this gives you an idea of kind of how you can go about choosing a good color scheme using a, well-defined and artistic, color scheme where your colors actually work well together, rather than just saying, okay, steak restaurant, let's choose a red, and let's choose, brown, and, whatever. You can be a lot more smart about your choice of color. Another tool that I like a lot is this Peloton. Get it to pop up. Every time I go to click on it, let's see, where is this? Bottom. This guy. So this tool lets you kind of design your loads. Again, really similar. Kind of lets you choose your main color, and then you can choose here if you want adjacent colors or you want your triad. Here would be like tetrad, so to do the square color scheme that I talked about. So having 4. So say for our steak restaurant, if we chose red as our main color here, this starts to make a little bit more sense. This is probably a color scheme that we could go with, doing the square color scheme with 4 evenly spaced colors. What's nice about it too is you can like save it and share the palettes. It kind of gives it this UID that gives you a nice preview of what the palette looks like. Again, so those are 2 tools that let you kind of go between different color schemes and kind of see what worked well together. Okay, that's about it as far as color schemes go. Again, it's hard because colors are subjective, but these are some tried and true color scheme methods, some tried and true ways of choosing colors that go well together, rather than just kind of picking them up, randomly. And again, this is an extremely simplistic explanation of how those schemes work, but it's really useful for us as web designers to make a site that looks good by choosing colors that go well together. Okay, any questions on colors? Okay. Well, I will get the assignment posted later today, so make sure you start thinking about that. So again, find 2 websites, and I'll have the list of the design principles. I won't ask you too much about, well, no, I will ask you about color. I'll ask you to describe the color scheme that the site uses, as well as like the dominance and similarity and rhythm and those principles, and just kind of describe in a few sentences for each one of those, how the site uses those things. So start, thinking about your favorite sites or sites that you've, noticed have good designs, and you'll work on that. All right, thanks guys. On Thursday, we're going to start talking about Bootstrap, which is a CSS framework that gives us some really awesome tools to use, and we'll kind of start digging into the next actual website assignment as well. So, and a quiz on Thursday. Don't forget that as well. Okay, thanks guys. Have a good rest of your day.